The story begins with the sound of wheels upon stone. It is not the sharp sound of a city, but the slow rhythm of travel through the countryside, the kind of rhythm that feels like breathing. In the early years of the 19th century, before the hum of engines or the whistle of steam, journeys were measured not by distance, but by patience. The road wound its way through the soft heart of England, a thread of dust and cobble that stretched between hedges, silvered by rain. Each wheel turn echoed faintly as if marking time itself. The air was damp with the scent of hay and iron. Mist clung to the low fields, and the sound of hooves softened the silence. The horses moved in steady unison, their breath rising in white clouds that vanished as quickly as they appeared. The coach swayed with their rhythm. Its lamps hung on either side of the driver, glowing faintly in the dimness before dawn, and each bump in the road made their flames tremble. Inside, the travellers sat wrapped in cloaks, their faces turned toward the fogged windows. The benches were narrow and worn smooth by countless journeys. Somewhere above, leather straps creaked. Somewhere below, a trunk shifted with a soft thud. No one spoke. Speech felt out of place here, as though words might break the quiet that the road itself demanded. At dawn, a pale light reached over the horizon, touching the roofs of barns and the high chimneys of coaching inns. Smoke rose from their hearths, slow and blue, mingling with the morning rain. The world seemed to stretch awake. A stable boy led out fresh horses, their coats steaming, their hooves ringing lightly on the stones. The driver climbed down, his boots dark with mud, and nodded toward the innkeeper, who appeared in the doorway with a lantern. For a brief moment, warmth spilled into the cold, the smell of bread, coffee, and wood smoke drifting into the dawn. Then the door closed. The wheels began to turn again. The road continued its long conversation with the countryside. Through the window, the land rolled by. Fields bounded by dry stone walls, orchards sleeping under a silver mist, cottages with windows so small they looked like blinking eyes. Sometimes a shepherd passed with his dog trotting at his heels, or a woman carrying a basket of eggs along the lane. The travellers watched these quiet lives from behind glass, each scene appearing and disappearing like a slow-moving dream. Hours passed. The rhythm of motion lulled them into stillness. One passenger leaned against the wall and slept. Another traced the outline of the fog upon the window pane. The sound of rain thickened, then faded again. Somewhere, a church bell marked the hour. Deep, unhurried, solemn. At midday, the coach stopped again. An inn stood at the crossroads, its sign creaking in the wind. Inside, a fire burned low in the hearth. Plates of stew and bread were laid on the tables. Steam curled from the dishes, and the weary passengers ate in silence, grateful for warmth more than for taste. The driver checked his watch, nodded once, and soon the road called them back. Afternoon came like a long sigh. The sky turned the colour of pewter. Trees leaned over the road, their branches dripping with rain. In the distance, hills blurred into shadow. The horses pressed on, their hooves steady as the ticking of a great clock. Every sound, the harness, the creak of the wheels, the faint chatter of the reins, became part of the same slow melody. By evening, the light had turned to amber. Villages glimmered briefly, their windows glowing like small promises against the darkening sky. Smoke drifted from chimneys. The smell of supper floated faintly on the wind. Onions, broth, something roasting unseen. The coach did not stop. It rolled on, carrying its small world of weary souls through the gathering dark. When night came fully, the road disappeared beneath shadow. The lamps were lit once more, their flames trembling in the wind. Beyond the glass, only shapes remained. The suggestion of hedges, the flash of a stream catching the moonlight, the ghostly flight of an owl across the lane. Inside, sleep spread slowly from one traveller to another. Heads nodded, breaths deepened. The road, the coach, the horses, all moved as one, like a long, unbroken thought stretching across the quiet land. Somewhere beyond the hills, a river glimmered under the moon. Its surface caught the faint light of the stars, carrying it downstream like a memory too gentle to fade. The coach passed beside it for a time, wheels murmuring softly on the damp stones. The sound was almost human, the sigh of distance, the whisper of motion. And then, as the night deepened and the lamps burned lower, the world seemed to fall entirely still. The road lay open ahead, endless and calm. No one spoke, no one moved. Only the slow rhythm of hooves remained, marking the passage of time through the sleeping countryside, steady, patient, eternal. The quiet road continued without hurry, beneath the stars. Steam and silence. Then almost quietly, the sound of the world began to change. It did not begin with thunder or the clamour of revolution, but with a steady pulse, a slow, rhythmic beat of iron against iron. From the north, where the fields met the smoke of new workshops, came a hum that seemed both alive and distant, as if the land itself were learning to breathe in a new way. Smoke began to appear where mist once gathered. It rose in long grey threads that hung above the hedgerows, caught in the branches of winter trees, drifting across quiet valleys that had never before known such clouds. Villagers would stop to watch, their faces turned upward, trying to decide if it was fog or something else entirely. They soon learned it was the mark of the new age, the first breath of the railway. Along the fresh-laid tracks, men worked in rhythm. Their hammers struck in even time, ringing out over the fields like the tolling of slow bells. Sparks flew, smoke curled, and the ground itself seemed to tremble faintly with each blow. These men had calloused hands and eyes red from the wind. They worked from dawn until the light faded, shaping the long veins of iron that would soon carry the world forward. Their voices were low, their movements careful, their breath rising like small ghosts in the cold air. In the early days, the engines were small, uncertain things, more like mechanical beasts than instruments of progress. They hissed and shuddered, their bodies painted black and brass, their wheels glinting with oil and heat. Yet when they moved, something in the earth seemed to awaken. The first journey across the countryside drew crowds who lined the embankments, their boots sunk into the wet soil. Children waved, dogs barked, and even the oldest farmers, who had spent their lives counting the seasons, stood in silence as the great machine passed. It came with a sound no one had heard before, not the rolling creak of a coach, not the distant rhythm of hooves, but a deep, unbroken breath of motion. Steam poured from its chimney, trailing behind like a white banner that never tore. The iron wheels sang as they met the rails, and the land that had once been marked by the slowness of time now felt its pulse quicken. Inside the carriages, passengers sat wide-eyed. The walls shook gently, the windows rattled, and beneath their feet they could feel the vibration of movement, a living tremor that ran through the boards like the heartbeat of the machine itself. They clutched their hats, their parcels, their sense of wonder. Through the glass, The countryside no longer passed slowly, but seemed to slide away like water. Hills, farms, and distant church towers blurred together. The air changed too, sharp with coal, warm with smoke, metallic on the tongue. It was not pleasant, but it was unforgettable. The first journeys lasted only an hour or two, but they changed the meaning of distance. What once required a full day on horseback could now be crossed before midday. The map of England seemed to draw itself closer, its corners folding inward. Markets that had once been isolated began to connect. Letters that once took weeks began to arrive within days. A new rhythm entered the life of the land, faster, louder, and yet, in its own way, strangely beautiful. At first, many resisted. Some feared the noise would drive away the birds or sour the milk of the cows. Others said that no good could come from such speed, that the soul was not meant to travel faster than the wind. But curiosity grew stronger than caution. Soon, even those who had sworn they would never trust a machine found themselves standing at the platform, ticket in hand, waiting to see the world from this new, moving window. Each departure became a small ceremony. The whistle blew, sharp as a blade, cutting through the air. Steam billowed upward, wrapping the platform in a brief, white fog. Then came the motion, slow at first, then gathering pace until the whole train seemed to glide forward effortlessly. People leaned out the windows, laughing, shouting, or simply staring. They were watching the future arrive, one wheel turn at a time. By night, the stations glowed like islands of warmth along the dark countryside. Lamps hung above the doors, their light reflected on wet stones and the gleam of metal rails. Porters carried trunks through the mist, their footsteps echoing softly. In the distance, the sound of a departing train faded into the hills, a low, rhythmic murmur that seemed to merge with the heartbeat of the earth itself. Villages that had once slept in silence began to know this new sound, not unpleasant, just different. It came like the tide, distant at first, then swelling gently, then fading again into the night. For those lying awake in their cottages, it was a reminder that the world beyond their fields was moving, and that movement, for better or worse, could not be stopped. And yet, for all its noise and energy, the new age carried its own kind of stillness. On the platform at dusk, when the last train had gone and the smoke drifted slowly above the tracks, silence returned. But it was no longer the same silence. It was filled with memory, the ghost of motion, the echo of speed. The world had learned a new rhythm, and even in rest, it could not entirely forget. In time, the landscape itself changed. The old coaching inns grew quiet. The wide roads where horses once laboured began to empty. The age of hooves gave way to the age of pistons. But in the quiet corners of the countryside, where the tracks curved beside rivers or passed through meadows of tall grass, something gentle remained. Birds nested between the sleepers. Wildflowers grew along the embankments, bright against the soot-dark earth. The machines had brought change, but nature, in her patience, had learned to breathe beside them. Sometimes, on calm evenings, travellers would still choose the long road, walking where the old coaches once rolled, following the scent of wet stone and moss. They said the air felt different there, as if it remembered another kind of journey, slower, softer, guided by patience rather than progress. And when the wind carried the faint whistle of a train across the hills, it sounded less like an interruption and more like a continuation, a new verse added to an ancient song. The quiet road, and the iron road were never enemies. They were two measures of the same melody, the rhythm of people moving through time, seeking connection, balance, and the simple wonder of seeing the world in motion. And so the age of steam began not with violence, but with curiosity. A deep, steady pulse that joined the silence rather than breaking it. The wheels turned, the pistons moved, and the land, once ruled by stillness, learned how to hum. The long passage. At each station, steam drifted across the platform, soft as breath. It curled around boots and benches, wrapped itself around the iron posts, and faded into the cool air like memory. Lamps glowed through it, blurred halos of gold, and the figures moving beneath seemed almost ghostly. Porters in caps, women in shawls, the faint shapes of travellers stepping down to stretch their legs. The sound of the valves hissed gently, steady as the exhale of a sleeping creature. Above it all came the low murmur of voices, calm and half lost. The language of journeys, spoken between strangers who would never meet again. Porters called softly, their words drawn out by the mist. They carried trunks and parcels with practiced ease, boots ringing faintly on the planks. A whistle blew somewhere in the dark, sharp at first, then echoing into silence. Children pressed their faces to the windows, eyes wide, watching the world drift by beyond the steam. Each new sight, a bridge, a signal lamp, the distant outline of a hill, seemed to arrive and vanish at once, like a dream shifting shape. Inside the carriages there was warmth, the kind of warmth that carries the sound of breathing. Coal smoke clung faintly to the air, mingled with the scent of damp wool and leather. The seats were lined with velvet worn smooth by countless passengers. When the engine began to move again, the walls trembled softly, a rhythm more felt than heard. The world outside started to slide backward, and those within sank into that familiar half-silence that only long travel can bring. Some read by the glow of the small lamps fixed above their heads. Their pages flickered with light as the train curved through the countryside. Others gazed through the glass, their reflections pale, their eyes lost somewhere between the window and the night beyond it. Now and then one would reach to wipe away the fog that gathered on the pane, leaving the trace of a hand that vanished almost immediately. Time stretched thin inside that moving room. Each mile felt both endless and fleeting. Outside, the sky deepened from grey to indigo. The last of the daylight lingered only on the far edge of the horizon, where it met the low clouds. The fields grew dark, their boundaries marked only by the faint gleam of water in the ditches and the white flicker of distant lamps from farmhouses. Occasionally, a spark flared beside the rails, a flash of orange from the engine's heart, and for a moment the smoke became a ribbon of fire before fading back into shadow. The rhythm of the wheels settled into something almost musical. The steady beat merged with the gentle sway of the carriage, and soon, even those who had tried to stay awake found their thoughts drifting. Sleep came easily on such nights, not as a heavy fall, but as a soft folding of the mind. The sound of motion became the sound of rest. Dreams began to take the shape of passing towns glowing faintly under the moon. Through the open window of the last compartment, the wind carried fragments of scent. Rain on iron, smoke on grass, the faint sweetness of wildflowers crushed beside the tracks. Somewhere far off, a dog barked once and was gone. The countryside itself seemed to listen as the train passed, its fields and hedges holding still for a heartbeat before returning to their quiet rhythm. At times, the train crossed wide stretches of open land where no lights shone at all. In those moments, the passengers saw only their own reflections layered over the darkness. It was like looking into water, a moving mirror filled with shadows. The lamps inside flickered softly, turning faces into gentle shapes of gold and grey. The silence there felt older than the machine that carried them, a silence born of distance and repetition, of wheels and night. The journey was not hurried. It did not promise arrival, it only offered continuation. The rails stretched ahead in perfect symmetry, vanishing into a darkness that seemed endless, yet strangely kind. The engine moved as though guided by memory rather than direction, its breath steady, its purpose certain. There was peace in that, a sense that the world, for all its change and noise, still contained places where time could move without struggle. Hours passed like slow waves. The whistle blew again at some unseen crossing, its echo rolling over the fields. Then came another station, a small cluster of lamps, a few waiting figures, a line of trees swaying in the smoke. Doors opened, footsteps sounded, and for a moment the air was full of quiet exchanges, tickets handed over, farewells spoken softly, the click of a latch. Then, as always, the train began to move again. In the glow of the lamps, the rails gleamed ahead, twin lines of silver curving into night. The countryside lay asleep on either side, fields folded beneath the mist, rivers glimmering faintly as they caught the scattered light. From inside the carriage it looked endless. Not a landscape, but a state of being where movement itself was the only constant. The travellers remained still, lulled by the gentle sway. Some dreamt of cities waiting beyond the horizon, others thought of home. But for that stretch of time between one station and the next, they all belonged to the same quiet passage, a moment suspended between departure and arrival, between steam and silence. And as the night deepened, the sound of the train softened too. The wheels no longer sang, they murmured. The engine's breath thinned into the cool air. Far ahead, a signal light glowed red, then turned green, its colours reflecting briefly in the wet rails before fading. The train continued, not rushing toward its destination, but gliding through the heart of stillness itself. Somewhere beyond the window, a river ran parallel to the tracks, its surface shining like dark glass beneath the stars. For a while, the two paths, water and iron, seemed to move together, bound by the same quiet purpose, to carry what they could gently toward the waiting dawn. Beneath the city. As the years passed, travel sank below the surface of the earth. The quiet rhythm that had once rolled across fields and valleys began to echo in tunnels of brick and iron. London, the old and restless city, was changing again. Beneath its cobbled streets and gaslit corners, men dug through layers of clay and stone, carving out dark corridors that would soon hum with motion. It began with dust. The ground was opened, brick by brick, and the sound of picks and shovels filled the silence that had once belonged to footsteps. Lanterns hung from beams above the workers, their flames wavering in the stale air. Each strike of the hammer sent a dull tremor through the walls. The smell of earth and smoke mingled together, thick and metallic. In those early days, no one knew quite what shape this new creation would take. Only that it would carry people not across the land, but through it. When the tunnels were finished, they stretched like veins beneath the city, curving gently from one district to another. Engineers lined them with brick, arch upon arch, until the walls shone faintly under lamplight, smooth and solid, as if time itself had been laid into them. Steam hung in the air long before the trains arrived, a soft haze that never entirely cleared. The sound of dripping water echoed from unseen corners. Above ground, London carried on. The bells of St. Paul's still chimed the hours, carriages still rolled over wet stones, and markets still opened with the first light. But below, something new stirred. The air there was different, close and heavy, as if it remembered the weight of the centuries that pressed down upon it. The first passengers descended by narrow stairways, their hands trailing along the cold railings. Lamps flickered along tiled walls, turning shadows into movement. The stairs spiraled down into the earth, where the hum of steam grew louder. At the base, the platform opened like a small cathedral built of soot and iron. Everything glowed faintly yellow. The tiles, the pillars, the faces of those who waited. A distant rumble approached, at first uncertain, then growing into a steady vibration that shook the soles of their shoes. The tunnel filled with smoke and warmth, and then, from the darkness, a light appeared, round, golden, and trembling, like an eye opening in the deep. The first underground train slid into view, its lamps casting long beams that danced along the brick. The engine exhaled sharply, steam rolled forward, curling around the platform edge. The air grew warmer, thick with the scent of coal and oil. Passengers stepped back instinctively, clutching their hats and coats. A moment later, the doors opened with a soft sigh, and the new world invited them in. Inside the carriage, the space was narrow and close. Wooden seats lined the walls, polished smooth by use. Lamps burned overhead, their light reflected in brass fittings that trembled with every movement. The noise was constant, but not harsh, a layered hum of wheels, pistons, and the distant heartbeat of the city above. It was not the open sound of countryside travel, but a deep, enclosed rhythm that felt both mechanical and strangely alive. When the train began to move, the sensation was unlike anything the passengers had known. The walls of the tunnel slid past only a few feet away, their bricks glinting with moisture. The windows offered no view but the flicker of lamps as the train passed each arch. For some, it was unsettling, to move through the earth itself, surrounded by darkness. For others, it was exhilarating, the sound of progress taking shape beneath their feet. They could feel the vibration in their bones. The lamps swayed slightly with the motion, and the shadows seemed to breathe. Some passengers spoke in hushed voices, remarking on the speed, the heat, the strangeness of the air. Others sat silently, eyes closed, listening to the steady rhythm of iron and steam. There was comfort in its regularity, a new kind of heartbeat for a city learning to move faster than ever before. At each stop, the train exhaled again, releasing clouds of smoke that drifted toward the roof and lingered there like mist. Doors opened, new faces entered, boots scraped, coins clinked, and the faint rustle of newspapers followed. Yet even amid these small sounds, a stillness seemed to hold. Down here, beneath the weight of stone and the noise of the world above, time slowed. Every movement felt deliberate, every breath deliberate. The walls themselves seemed to listen. Drops of condensation ran down the tiles, catching the light before falling to the ground. Somewhere in the distance, a valve hissed, echoing through the tunnels like a whisper. The air tasted faintly of iron. When the train paused at the far end of the line, the doors opened to another underground station, almost identical to the first. Tiled, dimly lit, and shimmering faintly with the heat of the engine. Passengers stepped out into the wavering light. their footsteps mixed with the steady drip of water from the roof. Some hesitated before climbing the stairs, pausing to look back into the tunnel where the engine waited, its lamps burning steadily in the dark. Up above, the city continued without noticing. Smoke from chimneys drifted into the grey sky. Bells rang, the river flowed quietly beneath the bridges, but deep below, London had begun a second life, one of tunnels, echoes, and endless motion. In time, more lines were built. The network spread outward, connecting distant boroughs and forgotten streets. The map of the city doubled, mirrored beneath itself. Yet no matter how large it grew, the underground remained a place of stillness wrapped inside motion. A world where the sound of travel became the sound of breathing. Even now, long after the age of steam has passed, those tunnels still hum with quiet persistence. Trains glide through them not with smoke, but with the same steady assurance, carrying lives, stories, silences. The scent of dust still lingers, the echo of the first engine still seems to move along the walls. The city above has changed 100 times, but below, the rhythm remains. It is the pulse of a world that never truly sleeps, beating softly beneath the stones of London. A whisper of steam, a memory of silence, a promise of motion that endures in the dark. The machinery of motion. Inside the carriages, people sat close together. The warmth of their breath mingled with the faint heat of the lamps, softening the chill that clung to their coats. The windows reflected their faces, pale, thoughtful, blurred by the tremor of motion. The world outside those panes was not a landscape, but a rhythm. Light, shadow, brick, darkness, light again. Each flicker of the tunnel lamps marked another heartbeat of the train, steady and unbroken. The sound of iron filled the air like slow thunder rolling beneath stone. It was not loud, but it was everywhere, in the seats, the floor, the hollow of one's chest. The vibration wrapped around each passenger, a continuous hum that seemed almost to breathe. Some closed their eyes and let it carry them. Others kept watch, following the faint lights as they slid along the damp tunnel walls. A child whispered to his mother, pointing at the moving glow, but his voice was lost in the layered rhythm of wheels and steam. The train moved without pause, neither rushing nor hesitating. Every motion felt deliberate, as though it had known this path for centuries. The air inside was close, thick with coal and warm metal, but the scent was oddly comforting, the smell of progress made tangible. Jackets brushed softly against one another as people shifted in their seats. A woman adjusted her hat, her gloved fingers glinting briefly in the lamplight. A man folded his newspaper and simply stared at the dark, as if listening to something only he could hear. Each tunnel light came and went with perfect regularity, like the pulse of a sleeping giant. Between them lay moments of near total blackness, when the carriage seemed to float in an endless void. Those intervals of dark felt strangely peaceful. Time suspended, thought paused. Then, without warning, the next light appeared, brushing gold across the passengers' faces and fading again before anyone could truly catch it. There was no view of fields or sky, no passing trees to measure distance. Only the steady motion through the earth. A journey both physical and inward. Many would later say that the underground changed not only how people travelled, but how they thought of space itself. To move unseen beneath the noise and weather of the city was to enter a new dimension of life. Somewhere above them, London continued its endless clatter. Hooves struck the streets, bells called the hour, smoke rose from chimneys into the grey. But down here, beneath the sound and light, there was only the steady breathing of the machine. It felt almost sacred, as though the city had two hearts now, one beating in daylight, one in the dark. Gradually, the tunnel began to brighten. The lamps outside grew further apart. The air shifted, cooler and thinner. The passengers felt the change before they saw it. A faint wind brushed through the open vent, carrying with it the smell of rain and smoke from the surface. Then came a widening glow ahead, grey, silver, and alive. When the train finally emerged, it was like surfacing from water. The darkness fell away, replaced by the broad expanse of sky. For a moment no one spoke. The sudden light dazzled the eyes, and the shapes of the city unfolded above them. Bridges, chimneys, rooftops blurred by mist. The sound changed too. The hollow rumble of the tunnel gave way to the open echo of streets. Wheels struck rails with brighter tone. The hiss of steam turned airy, almost musical. The journey had taken only minutes, yet it carried the feeling of having passed through another world. Those who stepped off at the next station did so with the quiet awareness that something invisible had shifted. Above them, life continued as before, carts moving, people calling, the river sliding past its banks. But they carried in their minds the memory of that passage through shadow. As the train continued along the open track, the city unfolded on every side. Rows of brick houses leaned together like weary companions. Bridges arched overhead, trailing smoke. The sky hung low, coloured the soft grey of early morning. It was London as it had always been, and yet, somehow, it felt newly alive. Beneath its cobblestones ran arteries of motion, unseen but constant, carrying thousands through the hidden veins of stone. From the bridge above, pedestrians would pause to watch the plume of steam rising from the tunnel mouth. They would see the carriages flash by, brief streaks of brass and shadow, and hear the deep note of iron echoing up through the arches. Some smiled, others frowned, uncertain of what such speed might mean. But none could deny the strange beauty of it, the sight of a city breathing through its own foundations. Evening brought a softer light. The lamps along the platforms flickered on, their glow reflected in wet pavement. Workers returned home in silence, their faces tired but calm. The trains came and went with mechanical grace, their rhythm blending into the heartbeat of the metropolis. From far below the pavements, a faint vibration could be felt, a reminder that movement never truly stopped. At night, when the last train had passed and the tunnels were empty, the silence beneath the city deepened. The air cooled, droplets of water fell in steady rhythm from the bricks. The tracks gleamed faintly under the maintenance lamps. Down there, the ghost of steam still lingered, a trace of warmth, a whisper of power. It was a peaceful silence, not of absence, but of waiting. And above, the city slept. The same streets that once echoed with hooves now rested under the hum of wires and lamps. Yet the connection remained, the road above and the rail below, the breath of air and the hiss of steam, the old and the new. Together they formed the quiet machinery of life, turning endlessly beneath the gaze of the stars. By morning, everything began again. The stairs filled with footsteps, the lamps flickered to life, and the trains rolled once more into the earth. People descended, carrying their own small histories, joining the larger rhythm of the city. The doors closed with a sigh, and the world moved forward, above and below, in silence and in steam, one continuous motion that bound them all together. The slow streets. On the surface, the streets of London moved at their own pace. The city did not rush, it stirred. Dawn crept slowly between the chimneys, softening the soot and silvering the rooftops. The fog that rose from the river drifted through alleyways, wrapping itself around the lamps that still burned from the night before. Beneath that pale haze, the world began to wake. The first sound of wheels, the shuffle of hooves, the muffled calls of drivers guiding horses through the narrow lanes. Omnibuses rolled by with a groaning rhythm, their great wooden frames swaying as they turned corners, slick with rain. The wheels struck the cobblestones in steady cadence, a sound half percussion, half heartbeat. Inside, passengers sat shoulder to shoulder on long benches, their coats brushed with the fine dust of the road. A child stared through the small window, tracing the pattern of drops that slid down the glass. A woman held her basket tightly against her lap, careful not to crush the flowers hidden beneath her shawl. The air carried the mingled scent of straw, wet leather, and the faint sweetness of the river nearby. At each stop, the door opened with a creak, and new sounds spilled in. Footsteps, greetings, the hiss of rain against the roofs. People stepped down, lifting hems and canes, to avoid the puddles that gathered in the uneven stones. A porter tipped his hat. A newspaper boy shouted headlines to no one in particular. The noise was gentle, layered, never loud. It was the hum of a living city, still waking, but already aware of its own movement. Children watched from the pavements, wide-eyed, fascinated by the omnibus's shining harnesses and great turning wheels. They waved at the passengers as the vehicles passed, leaving trails of mist and the faint echo of laughter. Above them, the tall brick buildings leaned inward toward the street, their upper windows glinting in the afternoon sun. Curtains fluttered faintly in the open air. Somewhere, a piano played a few uncertain notes behind glass. Street vendors began their work as the light grew stronger. The smell of roasted chestnuts drifted through the damp air. A man selling ribbons arranged his colors carefully upon a wooden board, reds and blues catching what little sun broke through the clouds. A woman ladled soup from a pot balanced on a cart, her hands moving with the grace of habit. Coins clinked softly, voices murmured in exchange, and the slow commerce of the day began. Further along, near the market, horses stamped their hooves impatiently, their breath rising like smoke. Drivers adjusted harnesses, their gloved hands quick despite the chill. The rhythm of the street was never truly still. It simply unfolded in cycles, motion, pause, exchange, continuation. Even the pigeons seemed to move in time, scattering and settling again with unhurried precision. By midday, the fog began to lift. Sunlight filtered through in pale gold ribbons, catching on the wet stones and the brass fixtures of the shop fronts. The air grew warmer, filled with the scent of bread from the bakeries and salt from the river wind. Workers paused at corners to speak briefly before moving on. A boy ran errands, weaving between carriages with practiced ease. Somewhere in the distance, a church bell marked the hour, slow and solemn. On the bridges, the world opened wider. The Thames rolled beneath, dark and patient, carrying the reflection of the sky in broken pieces. Barges drifted by, their sails low, their hulls heavy with coal. The sound of the river mixed with the sound of the streets, a slow duet of water and stone. Standing there, one could feel both the surface and the depth of London at once, the bright motion above and the quiet machinery below, hidden yet constant. As afternoon faded, the light changed again. The colour of the city softened to amber and grey. The omnibuses moved slower now, their wheels tired, their drivers cloaked against the chill. Gas lamps flickered to life along the roads, each one blooming with a gentle hiss. The glow spread down the lanes, reflecting in puddles, turning the wet cobbles into mirrors of liquid gold. Shopkeepers pulled in their awnings and swept the day's dust from their doors. The last of the vendors packed their wares under fading light. People returned home, clerks with ink-stained cuffs, women with baskets lighter than before, children trailing behind in tired silence. The air cooled, carrying with it the smell of smoke and supper. In the quieter neighborhoods, the pace slowed even further. Cats moved like shadows along garden walls. Curtains were drawn, fires lit. From open windows came the sound of conversation, of cutlery, of life unfolding in gentle rhythm. The city was vast, but each street carried its own small story, its own quiet pulse. Night settled softly as though descending on sighs. The last carriages rattled past, their lamps flickering against the dark. The river shimmered faintly beneath the bridges, and the fog returned once more, erasing sharp edges, blending the world into muted colour and sound. Somewhere beneath it all, the underground trains continued to move, their hum rising through the stones like the echo of a heartbeat. The people on the surface did not hear it clearly, but they felt its presence in the steady vibration underfoot. It was the hidden rhythm of the city, carrying life forward even as the streets above grew still. And yet, for all its movement, there was peace in the slowness of the streets. The horses' hooves on stone, the rustle of coats in passing, the faint song of a distant organ grinder. These sounds formed the music of a world that had not yet forgotten patience. London breathed in its own time, neither rushing nor stopping, suspended between noise and silence. By midnight, only the watchman remained. The lamps burned low, the air heavy with mist. The streets, emptied of their crowds, seemed to dream. Above, the stars glimmered faintly through the haze. Below, the trains whispered through the tunnels, unseen. Between them stretched the sleeping city, its heart slow, steady, eternal. Evening on the bridges. By evening, the lamps were lit along the bridges. Their glow trembled upon the wet stone, scattering gold across the dark surface of the Thames. The air was cool and full of breath, human, animal, and river alike, mingling into one slow exhale that drifted beneath the arches. Cabmen waited by the curb, their horses shifting slightly, hooves striking soft echoes into the mist. The reins hung loose, glistening with dew. From time to time, one of the horses stamped the ground and snorted, sending a faint cloud upward into the light, before settling again into stillness. The mist that rose from the river softened everything it touched. The edges of the bridges blurred, the outlines of buildings dissolved into shadow. The gaslight shimmered through the haze, its glow caught in droplets of moisture suspended in the air. Sound carried differently in such weather, gentler, slower. The calls of cabmen, the murmur of footsteps, the clatter of distant wheels all arrived with a rounded tone, as if the city were speaking in half whispers. On the bridge itself, a few figures crossed in silence. Some were workers returning from the river docks, their boots heavy with mud. Others were women carrying parcels wrapped against the damp, their shawls pulled close around their faces. The rhythm of their steps matched the slow movement of the water below, the rise and fall of the tide, against the stone piers. Above them, the lamps formed a line of patient fire, each flame bending slightly with the wind. Along the embankment, the city's lights multiplied, reflected in the river like long, wavering threads. Barges moored along the shore rocked gently, their ropes creaking in time with the current. The smell of coal smoke hung in the air, mingled with the faint salt of the sea and carried up the river's mouth. Somewhere far off, a bell struck the hour. Deep, deliberate, echoing through the fog, like a reminder that time was still keeping watch, even when the world seemed half asleep. Cabmen called softly to one another, their voices muted by the fog. Some smoked pipes, the small orange glow of the tobacco pulsing faintly in the dark. Their horses stood in quiet lines, waiting for passengers who might not come until long after midnight. The rhythm of hooves on wet pavement came and went in waves. A carriage would approach, its lamps glowing pale through the mist, its wheels hissing softly as they turned. Then just as quickly, it would fade again into the grey distance, leaving only the echo of motion behind. For those walking home, the streets felt wider at night, emptier, as though the city had drawn in its breath and paused. Curtains glowed faintly in upper windows, and behind them the shadows of quiet domestic life moved, the setting of a table, the slow extinguishing of a lamp, the silhouette of a hand closing a curtain. Down below, the river answered with its own unhurried sound, the slow lap of water against the quay, the occasional ripple that caught a stray light and carried it away. Travel within the city was slow but steady. There was no haste, no urgency. The movement itself had become the shape of life, a pattern of departures and arrivals, of lamps and doors, of footsteps crossing puddles, of carriage wheels turning under the dim glow of gaslight. The city. At the edge of Covent Garden, musicians played for the few who lingered, their notes rising through the damp night air and fading almost immediately into mist. A violin sang quietly near the market wall, accompanied by the faint rhythm of a drum tapped with bare fingers. A few couples passed, their voices soft, their laughter small and fleeting, like sparks that vanished before they touched the ground. Further west, the streets narrowed again. The lamps leaned over the cobblestones, their glass damp with condensation. Shop shutters were drawn down, taverns glowed with the dim warmth of coal fire. The smell of ale and roasted meat drifted through open doors, mingling with the cooler scent of rain-soaked stone. Inside, the murmur of conversation formed another rhythm, slower, lower, wrapped in smoke and comfort. Above all these layers, the sound of hooves, the breath of the river, the quiet music, the flicker of lamps. London seemed to move as one body, vast yet deliberate. Its heart beat not in haste, but in patience. It was a city built upon endurance, upon the knowledge that movement need not always mean speed. The people walked, the carriages rolled, the trains beneath the streets hummed softly in their tunnels, all parts of the same long exhalation that carried life forward. As night deepened, the fog thickened again. The bridges vanished first, their lights fading into faint orbs, suspended in the mist. The last carriages crossed slowly, their iron rims hissing against the wet stone. Cabmen pulled their coats tighter. The horses bowed their heads. Across the river, the faint shape of St. Paul's Dome appeared and disappeared like a dream. For a moment, it seemed that the whole city had turned inward, that every street, every lamp, every ripple of the Thames had agreed to rest. And yet, beneath that stillness, life continued, the soft movement of the river, the unseen pulse of the underground, the steady turning of the world itself. By midnight, even the fog began to settle. The lamps shone steadier, their flames small but sure. The water below reflected them in trembling lines, carrying the light downriver toward the sea. The horses stood motionless, half asleep. The cabmen leaned back in their seats, their voices gone quiet. Above the bridges, the mist thinned just enough for a few stars to show through. They gleamed faintly over the city, patient, ancient, watching. And down below, the rhythm of London went on, slow, steady, endless, like the breathing of something immense and alive, content simply to move, to glow, to endure. On the water. Beyond the city, another rhythm waited, the slow roll of water against wood. The air was cooler here, freer, touched by the scent of moss and the faint sweetness of damp reeds. Along the canals, barges moved with the patience of drifting clouds, their dark hulls sliding through silver light. The surface rippled gently beneath them, folding and unfolding like a slow breath. Men walked along the towpaths, their boots leaving quiet marks in the dew. Each held a rope looped around one shoulder, guiding the horses that pulled the heavy boats forward. The sound was soft. The low creak of timber, the slap of rope against water, the rhythmic splash of hooves sinking into the mud. The horses moved steadily, their harnesses shining where the early sun touched the brass. Their breath came in small clouds that hung for a moment before dissolving into mist. In the early light, the world was reduced to grey and silver. Mist gathered above the surface, blurring the line between air and water. Trees, cottages, and chimneys appeared as pale reflections, trembling slightly with each ripple. When a barge passed, its bow cut through the mirrored world, breaking it apart only for it to close again behind, seamless, patient, whole. On the decks, life unfolded slowly. Women prepared tea inside the narrow cabins, the steam from the kettle mixing with the cool air that drifted through small round windows. Tin cups clinked softly. The smell of bread, coal smoke, and damp rope mingled in the confined space. A child sat by the open hatch, watching the ripples dance around the boat's side, his reflection merging with the water below. The family moved as one, quiet, practiced, attuned to the rhythm of their floating world. Each day began the same way, and that sameness was its comfort. The canal was a line of memory across the countryside, passing fields and stone bridges, mills and meadows. Birds skimmed low across the water, their wings barely touching the surface. Sometimes a heron stood motionless near the reeds, its reflection sharp and still. Everything seemed to exist in a slower measure of time, a different kind of day where nothing hurried, nothing demanded. At the bends of the canal, the men's voices carried softly. They called to the horses in tones of gentle patience, guiding them around corners where the rope dipped into the water. The echo of those calls drifted along the banks, blending with the steady whisper of current. From the next field came the faint toll of a church bell, muffled by distance, as if marking not the hour, but the heartbeat of the land itself. The canal passed through small villages built close to the water. Stone cottages leaned toward the path, their gardens spilling ivy and lavender over low walls. Children waved from the bridges, their laughter mixing with the creak of the barge. Laundry hung in pale rows beside the canal, fluttering in the weak breeze. In the windows, old women paused from their work to watch the slow parade of boats, each one carrying goods, letters, and stories between places most people would never see. By midday, the mist lifted and the light turned golden. The water reflected the colour of the fields and the red roofs beyond. Barges moored along the banks while their crews rested. Horses were unhitched, their harnesses removed, their backs brushed with straw. The men sat on overturned barrels, smoking pipes and speaking little. The air was filled with the smell of tea, tar, and sunlight on wet rope. A kettle whistled softly. A spoon tapped against enamel. Sometimes the quiet was broken by laughter, low, tired, but sincere. Life on the water was hard, yet it carried its own peace. There were no crowds here, no cobblestones, no rush. The canal gave everything a steady rhythm, the pull of the rope, the tilt of the deck, the sound of the rudder dipping into water. The world above might race toward its future of iron and steam, but here time remained in its gentler shape. In the afternoon, the boats began to move again. The horses leaned into their harnesses, the ropes tightened with a low hum. The sun lowered behind the trees, its light gliding across the ripples like brushed metal. The barges slid beneath old bridges where ivy hung low, where water dripped from stone and echoed in the narrow arch. For a brief moment everything went dark, the sound of the world reduced to water and breath, and then light returned as they emerged on the other side. Toward evening, the air cooled again. Smoke rose from cottage chimneys, bending in the wind. The canal reflected the sky's fading colours, rose, lavender, grey. Ducks floated lazily beside the banks. A woman sang quietly from one of the cabins, her voice rising just above the sound of the current. It was not a song meant to be heard, but one meant to be carried, a hum that belonged to the water itself. When night fell, the barges moored together along the bank. Lanterns were lit, their small flames wavering in the damp air. Reflections of those lights shimmered across the canal like tiny suns adrift. Inside the cabins, supper was eaten by the glow of oil lamps. The air smelled of stew, candle wax, and river water. Outside, the horses slept standing, heads bowed, their manes gently stirred by the wind. The world above might have been loud and bright, filled with engines and light, but down here the silence held its own power. The water moved in endless patience, carrying reflections of stars instead of clouds now. The barges floated as though the night itself bore them forward. From time to time, a ripple spread from the hull, caught the starlight, and vanished. Even after the lanterns were extinguished, the faint sound of movement continued. The whisper of current against wood, the soft creak of rope, the deep, slow sigh of the earth, turning toward another dawn. The canal never truly slept. It only rested between breaths. By morning, mist would rise again, silver and weightless. The ropes would tighten, the horses would walk, and the barges would begin their journey once more, unhurried, unchanging, eternal. The city's noise would return someday, far behind them, but out here the world moved by water's will, slow, deliberate, and infinite in its calm. The last light on the water. Travel by canal was slow but peaceful. The world beside the water seemed to breathe differently, deeper, quieter, more deliberate. Villages appeared at the bends of the canals, their church towers rising through the morning fog like the tips of dreams not yet fully awake. Stone bridges arched overhead, their reflections meeting perfectly on the surface below, so that for a moment every crossing seemed to form a perfect circle between heaven and earth. Smoke curled from chimneys. A dog barked once, then the sound faded into mist. The rhythm of the canal was unbroken. The horses walked at an even pace, their hooves muffled on the damp towpath. Each step sent a small tremor through the rope that connected them to the barge. The men walked beside, sometimes whistling, sometimes silent. Their boots carried the smell of earth and rain. Behind them, the boat drifted like a thought half-formed, its motion slow enough that one could watch the world move past in full detail. The reeds bending, the ripples widening, the reflection of a bird slicing through its own mirrored flight. In the early hours, mist covered everything in shades of silver. The light had no edge, it simply spread, soft and clean. Water and sky became one. A woman leaned from the cabin to empty a kettle, and the steam joined the fog as though it had always belonged there. Her children still slept inside, curled together beneath a blanket patched from old sails. The smell of tea drifted out across the canal. Faint, sweet, familiar. By midday, the fog began to lift, revealing the gentle rise and fall of farmland. Fields of barley swayed in the faint wind. Trees lined the canal like guardians, their branches arching over the path. The air smelled of grass and wood smoke, of life made from patience. Along the banks, men mended nets, women scrubbed clothes against the stones, and children ran barefoot through puddles, laughing at the echo of their own footsteps. At the next village, the barge paused. A baker's boy crossed the bridge with a basket, the cloth covering it still warm from the oven. The horses drank from buckets by the path, while their handlers leaned against the wall, sharing bread and quiet talk. Bells from the nearby church marked the passing hour. Slow, heavy, deliberate. It was the same rhythm the canal had known for centuries, unchanged by the noise of new machines that roared in distant towns. As the afternoon wore on, the light turned golden. The water deepened to bronze, its ripples catching the color of the sky. The barge moved again, cutting through the reflection of clouds. Ducks rose suddenly from the reeds, their wings scattering drops of sunlight. The rope tightened once more, and the horse leaned forward with calm strength. Every motion belonged to a larger pattern: pull, drift, release, rest. The language of endurance. Villages appeared and disappeared like slow thoughts. Their church spires were the only signs that stayed visible for miles, pale against the soft horizon. At one bend, a windmill turned lazily, its blades cutting the light in slow, even circles. Laundry hung by the banks, its white cloth glowing in the afternoon sun. And in every window that faced the water there was a face, watching, listening, as though the passage of a single barge were enough to mark the day's turning. Toward dusk, the canal became a mirror. The last ripples stretched themselves thin, then vanished into stillness. Smoke from chimneys hung low, unmoving. The horses' reflections walked beneath them in the water, step for step. The men grew quiet, their voices softened by distance. Even the birds seemed to lower their songs. The world turned amber, a colour of endings, of memory. Lanterns were lit along the decks, one by one. Their small flames wavered on the water, stretching into long lines of gold that trembled with the faintest motion. The light reflected upon the faces of those aboard, warm, uncertain, tender. Supper was eaten from tin bowls, the sound of spoons and laughter mingled softly. Someone began to hum a tune too old to name. The canal, dark and wide, carried the echo away. Night settled gently. The stars appeared in the black surface of the water before they were visible in the sky. The air cooled, but not sharply, only enough to remind the travellers of their distance from the city. In the darkness, the world felt larger, yet closer too. The faint creak of wood and the occasional plop of a fish rising to the surface were the only signs of movement. Even later, when the railway took their place, the canals remained, as veins of memory running quietly through the land. The great iron tracks crossed them like new arteries, but neither erased the other. One carried speed, the other carried silence. In winter, steam from distant trains would drift across the fields and meet the still mist of the water, and for a moment, old and new would blend. Two breaths of the same world. The barges that once carried coal and grain became slower, fewer, but never vanished. Some turned to carrying flowers or milk, or the quiet weight of solitude. Others were left moored along forgotten banks, their paint peeling, their ropes half sunk in moss. Yet even in stillness, they did not feel abandoned. The canal itself kept them, a resting place, a memory. And when the wind passed across their hulls, it sounded almost like the whisper of water against motion, as though they remembered how to move. In some places, the towpaths became narrow trails for walkers, and the old bridges, softened by ivy, remained like small monuments to patience. Children would lean over them, tossing stones and watching the ripples expand outward, learning, without knowing it, the old rhythm of waiting. The world moved on, but the canals kept their own time. Their waters carried not only goods but stories, of families who lived aboard, of horses who knew the way home without a word, of travellers who found comfort in the steady hum of water beneath them. Each reflection that trembled on their surface, of a tree, a tower, a passing cloud, was another memory briefly held, then released. Now, when the evening mist returns and the light fades low, those waters still shine. The lanterns may have changed to electric bulbs and the horses to engines, but the patience remains. The quiet pulse of a world that once moved only as fast as its heart allowed. If one stands beside the canal at twilight and listens carefully, the sound is still there. The faint lapping of water against wood, the echo of a rope tightening, the murmur of an unseen voice calling gently to a horse that no longer walks. The canal continues its journey, calm and eternal, carrying the reflection of the sky, a mirror of all the centuries that have passed, and all the stillness that endures. The still waters. Travel by canal was slow but peaceful. The pace of the water was the pace of breathing, steady, patient, and full of quiet intent. Nothing hurried there. Each movement unfolded with the same calm rhythm that shaped the clouds above and the ripples below. Villages appeared at the bends of the canal, their outlines softened by mist. The air smelled faintly of damp stone, hay, and wood smoke drifting from unseen chimneys. Church towers rose through the fog like memories made of stone, their bells muffled by distance. Along the banks, narrow paths followed the water's curve. Horses walked there, slow and sure-footed, their reins held loosely by men who guided them with murmured words. The sound of hooves mixed with the gentle lap of water against wood, a music of patience. Sometimes a bird rose from the reeds, its wings scattering droplets of morning light. The water trembled, then returned to stillness. Barges glided with quiet dignity, their long shapes painted in colors faded by sun and rain, deep green, red, ochre, the hues of earth and labor. Ropes stretched taut between horse and hull, dipping into the canal where they traced small ripples that fanned outward and vanished. From the cabins came faint signs of life, the hiss of a kettle, the clink of tin against enamel, the soft laughter of a family who had made the water their home. Villages appeared at intervals like verses in a long, unending song. Their bridges arched over the canal in graceful silence, each stone worn smooth by weather and time. Children leaned over the parapets to wave at the passing barges. Their reflections met them on the surface below, waving back in fractured light. A baker stood at his doorway, the smell of warm bread drifting across the towpath. The travellers would catch it on the wind, a fleeting comfort, gone before it reached the next bend. The world by the canal seemed to exist in a different measure of time. Morning arrived slowly, dissolving the mist in silver sheets. The afternoons stretched wide and unhurried, filled with the sounds of wind in the hedges and the occasional creak of a tiller turning. Even the voices of those who worked there carried the same softness, low, drawn-out syllables that matched the rhythm of the current. At dusk, the world turned amber. The low sun caught the water and turned it to glass, reflecting the shape of every tree and chimney in perfect stillness. The last ripples stretched into long lines before disappearing. The horses were unharnessed and led to drink. Smoke rose from the cabin chimneys, curling upward in lazy spirals. A woman leaned from the hatch to pour tea, the steam mingling with the golden air. Across the fields, the first lamps of the village began to glow, their light trembling on the water like distant fireflies. Lanterns were lit along the decks one by one. Their flames flickered in the faint wind, forming wavering lines of gold that danced on the darkening canal. The water caught every glimmer, carrying it onward as though light itself were drifting through the countryside. In the reflection, the boats appeared doubled, real above, dream below. Somewhere, a night bird called, its cry long and lonely, answered only by the soft hum of the current. Inside the cabins, supper was quiet. The day's work left its scent on every surface: rope, coal, bread, and damp wool. A child's wooden toy lay beside the kettle, worn smooth by small hands. The table rocked gently with the movement of the boat. Outside, the horses grazed in the half-dark, their breath visible in the cool air. Nothing hurried. The night came not as an interruption, but as a continuation of the same rhythm. The slow, unbroken pulse of life by water. Even later, when the railway took their place, the canals remained, patient as ever, unchanged in their purpose. The sound of the trains rolled across the fields like distant thunder, but the water did not answer. It only reflected the passing smoke, turned it into drifting clouds, and carried on beneath. For those who had once known the calm of the towpath, the new noise felt strange, too fast, too final. Yet in the evenings, when the light fell low and the air stilled, they would walk again by the old canals and find that the quiet world had not disappeared. It had merely gone deeper, waiting beneath the hum of progress. The barges moved less often, but their presence lingered. Some carried coal or grain for the cities still, their captains stoic men who preferred water's patience to iron's speed. Others had become homes moored in forgotten places, their windows filled with potted plants and the soft glow of lamplight. Ducks nested under their hulls, reeds grew thick around their mooring lines. The canals themselves had turned into long mirrors for the sky, ribbons of reflection winding through the land. In spring, the water carried petals from fallen blossoms, drifting like slow snow. In autumn, it carried leaves, each one circling in its own quiet current. And in winter, when frost tightened its surface and the mist thickened until sound itself seemed to fade, the world above paused. Yet below, the canal still held its deep, dark motion, unseen but alive. For travellers who came long after, the canals were more than waterways. They were memories given form, reminders of how the world once moved by patience alone. Standing beside them, one could still hear the faint echo of footsteps along the towpath, the soft murmur of a horse's breath, the whisper of rope through calloused hands. These were the sounds of a slower existence, not lost, only sleeping beneath the noise of the modern age. At sunset, when light bends low across the fields and the air begins to cool, the canals return to their truest self. Their waters shine with the colour of honey and smoke. Every ripple seems to hold a story. The bridges, the barges, the reeds along the banks, all stand in quiet witness to a time when motion itself was an act of trust. And even now, when the night deepens and the world hums with speed, the canals keep their own pulse. They carry not just the reflection of the sky, but the reflection of time, the memory of endurance, the calm heart of a world that once believed that to move slowly was not to fall behind, but to belong. Across the sea, farther from the coast, the sound of travel deepened. The cries of gulls faded into distance, and the steady lap of the tide grew heavier, slower, as if the sea itself were drawing its breath. Steamships gathered at the harbours each morning, their funnels breathing pale smoke into the sky. The decks gleamed with salt. Ropes lay coiled in careful spirals. Flags stirred faintly in the breeze that came from the open water, cool and persistent. The air smelled of iron, tar, and the sharp sweetness of seaweed drying on the stone quays. Passengers arrived early, their boots echoing against the wooden planks of the dock. Trunks were lifted, tickets inspected, final words exchanged. The ships loomed above them, great shapes of riveted steel, their sides streaked with rust and sunlight. To board was to step into another world, one that moved by its own rhythm, unhurried and immense. From the rail, the passengers watched the shoreline fade, first as colour, then as outline, and finally as a soft blur, swallowed by the horizon. The city disappeared behind a veil of mist. The horizon widened until it became only sky and water, two vast mirrors reflecting each other endlessly. The landless space filled with sound, the slow churn of engines below, the soft hiss of foam against the hull, the wind pressing through the rigging. Each sound blended into a single rhythm, a low, patient pulse that seemed to steady the hearts of those aboard. Days at sea passed gently. The world of clocks and timetables dissolved. The sun became the only measure of time, rising pale, climbing white, descending in a wash of gold that rippled across the surface. The air shifted between mist and light, grey and silver, always moving yet always the same. The engines murmured continuously, their vibration running through the soles of shoes, through the railings, through the bones. It was a hum so constant that silence felt impossible without it. Passengers found their own quiet rituals. Some read beneath the canvas awnings, pages rustling softly in the breeze. Others leaned against the rail and watched the water glide by, endless and unbroken. A few played cards in the lounge, their laughter muted by the thick air. Children ran along the deck until the sea wind slowed them. Evenings brought a hush. People wrapped themselves in coats and blankets, gazing toward the edge of the world where the sun melted into silver haze. The scent of the ocean lingered on everything, clothes, hair, even letters tucked inside pockets absorbed the salt. Meals were served in narrow dining rooms where the lamps swayed with each motion of the waves. The taste of the sea was everywhere, in the air, in the soup, in the faint crystals that gathered on lips after hours on deck. Some nights, fog enveloped the ship entirely. The horn sounded at intervals, deep and mournful, its echo folding back upon itself. The world beyond the rail vanished. Only the steady vibration of the engines and the faint glow of the lamps reminded them they were still moving. At dawn, the fog often lifted. The ocean appeared again, vast, gleaming, and newly alive. The surface stretched smooth and endless, broken only by the wake unfurling behind them. It was said that no 2 days at sea were ever the same. Sometimes the water lay calm as glass, reflecting clouds with perfect clarity. Sometimes it rolled in long, slow swells that lifted the ship like a cradle. But always, it moved. Even in stillness, the sea carried a pulse, ancient and unrelenting. Crewmen worked quietly through the hours, polishing rails, scrubbing decks, checking ropes. Their movements were as fluid as the ship's own rhythm, guided by practice and memory. The sound of a brush against wet wood became another part of the sea's conversation. Occasionally, a sailor would pause and gaze toward the horizon, his face calm, his eyes reflecting the same endless grey. For them, the sea was not a place to cross, but a world to live within. In the afternoons, when sunlight spread across the decks, the passengers would gather in small groups, speaking softly, their voices carried away by the wind. The conversation often drifted to silence, replaced by the quiet comfort of presence. Strangers united by the same steady motion. The sky widened around them, and the boundary between sea and air grew thin. The world felt balanced there, caught between depths and clouds. As evening approached, the air cooled. The sea turned from blue to silver to black. The lamps on deck flickered to life, glowing softly through the dark. Below, the dining hall filled with the hum of voices and the faint clink of cutlery. Outside, the ship's reflection shimmered across the water, fractured and golden, disappearing and reforming with each swell. The air smelled of oil, salt, and something faintly floral. The lingering perfume of a passenger's scarf carried on the wind. Later, when the night deepened, the ocean became a field of moving stars. Phosphorescence trailed in the ship's wake. Small bursts of blue-green light stirred by motion, glowing briefly before fading into black. The passengers who lingered on deck watched in silence, the world reduced to 2 colors, the pale gold of the lamps and the cool shimmer of the sea. The engines continued their steady song below, the sound like a distant heartbeat that never ceased. Sometimes the horizon glowed faintly where another ship passed, a scatter of lights across the dark expanse, moving slowly, disappearing just as it appeared. It was a quiet reminder that even in isolation, they were not alone. Across the wide world, other ships traced their own lines of smoke and wake, stitching invisible paths across the surface of the water. On the calmest nights, when the wind died and the engines slowed, the sea mirrored the sky so perfectly that no one could tell where one ended and the other began. The passengers stood at the rail, wrapped in blankets, and watched the stars shimmer beneath them as much as above. The sound of the ship became the sound of breathing, a rhythm that matched the pulse of the ocean itself. And though their journeys would end, in new ports, new cities, new lives, each traveler carried with them something that could not be left behind, the sound of the sea's patience, the memory of that quiet pulse beneath every moment. Even after steamships gave way to faster vessels, the ocean kept its rhythm, unchanging and eternal. Across the sea, life still moved by its oldest rule, not haste, not noise, but the steady heartbeat of distance. Those who listened closely could still hear it. The deep whisper of engines, the sigh of wind through ropes, the slow applause of waves against the hull. The sound of a world in motion, vast, calm, and endless. The edge of arrival. At night, the stars spread across the sky, bright and cold. They seemed impossibly near, as though the air itself had thinned to nothing between light and gaze. The sea mirrored them with patient precision, each small wave carrying a flicker of silver, breaking the constellations into living fragments. The ship moved through it all like a slow brushstroke, its wake glowing faintly in the starlight. The world had no edges here, only reflection upon reflection, a sky beneath the sea and a sea above the sky. Somewhere below the deck, the engine continued its rhythm, a soft, unbroken heart of motion. It pulsed through the floorboards, through the railings, through the bones of every traveller asleep in their narrow cabins. The sound was steady and low, like breath in the dark. Every few moments, a quiet sigh of steam rose from the funnels, blending with the wind. The night smelled of salt and iron, of deep water and distance. The only movement was the slow lift and fall of the hull, like the rocking of a cradle too vast to see. Those who could not sleep lingered on deck. They stood wrapped in coats and blankets, gazing at the endless horizon. Some spoke softly, voices carried away by the wind. Others were silent, lost in the stillness that exists only in the middle of the sea. The ocean, under starlight, was not black, but blue. A dark, living blue that shifted with each swell. Far astern, the ship's wake trailed like a ribbon of light, glowing faintly with the soft shimmer of phosphorescent life. Time itself seemed to stretch thin. The boundary between night and morning blurred until the first suggestion of dawn, a pale brightness gathering in the east, trembling upon the edge of the water. The stars faded one by one, their reflections dissolving into mist. The air grew softer, warmer. The sea, which had seemed infinite and still, began to change colour, from ink to pewter to a quiet grey touched with rose. And then at last land appeared. It came slowly, almost reluctantly, as though waking from a long dream. At first it was nothing more than a darker shadow against the lightening horizon, uncertain and shifting. Then gradually faint points of brightness appeared, lamps along a shore, windows in early houses, a watchtower blinking its patient signal. The outlines of hills emerged, then the curve of a bay, and beyond that the faint suggestion of roofs and spires. The passengers stirred as the sound of the engine deepened. Crewmen moved about the decks with quiet efficiency, coiling ropes, preparing lines. A bell rang somewhere forward, its tone soft but clear in the morning air. The ship turned slightly, its hull gliding through the calm water with the gentlest resistance. The scent of land reached them then, faint but unmistakable, soil, smoke, and something green, something growing. The anchor dropped, chains unspooled in a slow cascade of sound, heavy, metallic, and echoing across the quiet harbour. The vibration ran through the water, through the ship, through the still air itself. The noise faded, replaced by a silence deeper than before. The sea, disturbed for a moment, smoothed again into calm, carrying only the ripple of light. For a while, no one moved. People stood at the rails looking toward the faint shapes of the port, still half veiled by morning mist. They could see figures moving on the dock, hear faint voices calling across the distance. The voyage had ended, yet the motion seemed still to echo through their bodies. After so many days of water and sky, the sight of solid earth felt both familiar and strange, as though the world had shifted slightly in its meaning. Travel had crossed another boundary, not only of distance, but of perception. The passengers had watched the world unfold and fold again. They had learned the rhythm of patience, the slow beat of the sea's heart. Now, as the gangways were lowered and footsteps sounded once more on wood and stone, something subtle had changed within them. What was near no longer felt small, and what was far no longer felt unreachable. The horizon, once a line that divided, had become a promise that everything seen and unseen was part of the same vast motion. The ship rested now, quiet in the harbour, its journey complete. Yet the sound of the sea lingered in every ear, that deep, steady rhythm of the engine beneath the waves, the heartbeat of distance itself. And as the sun rose over the hills, the water caught its light once more, turning gold, then silver, then clear. The reflection trembled and reformed, endless and unbroken, a reminder that all travel, whether across land, canal, or sea, is never an escape from the world, but a return to its quietest, most enduring rhythm. Wheels of freedom. On the land once more, the late century brought a smaller, quieter kind of motion. The world had already learned to move by steam and water, to cross continents and seas with noise and force. But now something gentler appeared. The bicycle arrived. At first it was awkward, tall frames, iron tires, the faint danger of imbalance. Men in coats and caps rode them like tightrope walkers, faces set in careful concentration. But soon the design changed. Lower, smoother, safer. The clumsy shapes gave way to grace, and with that transformation came a new rhythm, a new way of listening to the world. Along the paths outside the city, people began to learn the art of gentle movement. They practiced the slow turning of pedals, the subtle shifting of weight, the way balance could become its own form of calm. The sound of wheels on gravel was a steady hum, soft and even, like rain that never fell. The chain clicked faintly, the wind brushed against sleeves. For the first time in an age of engines and hooves, travel became something personal, silent and light. Fields opened beside the riders, villages passed in a calm blur, red roofs, washing lines, the smell of bread carried on the breeze. Dogs barked at the passing wheels, then fell quiet again. The road stretched onward, unrolling like a ribbon through the heart of the countryside. With every turn of the pedals, the air grew sweeter, filled with the scent of dust and flowers. The rhythm of the wheels was soothing, a quiet pulse that matched the breath. For many, it was the first time they could travel alone. No carriage to pay for, no horse to harness, no train to schedule, only the open path and the steady strength of their own motion. The bicycle became a companion, obedient to neither clock nor map. Riders discovered they could pause anywhere, at a field's edge, beside a river, beneath the shade of a willow, and the world would wait with them. In motion, they found stillness. Women rode too. At first, the sight startled the streets. Long skirts were lifted carefully and gathered with ribbons, gloves drawn tight, faces turned forward into the breeze. They rode not with defiance, but with calm assurance, as though freedom itself needed no announcement. Their hair loosened in the wind, their cheeks warmed with colour. The bicycle became a quiet revolution of balance and breath, a moving sanctuary where no one gave orders and no one followed. Morning light softened the fields into gold. The paths glowed pale between hedges heavy with dew. A woman pedalled slowly past, her shadow moving beside her like another self. The rhythm of her motion drew no attention, no sound but the soft turn of wheels. Freedom, it turned out, was not always loud. Sometimes it arrived on two thin lines of iron, humming gently against the earth. Children learned quickly. They raced one another along the lanes, laughter mingling with the song of the tires. Their bicycles rattled over stones and swerved through puddles, each ride a small adventure bounded only by daylight. To them, the road was infinite. The adults who watched from porches smiled quietly, remembering how the world had once felt, too large to cross on foot and too structured to wander at will. The bicycle gave back the small distances, the space between villages, the curves of forgotten roads, and made them human again. In the cities, bicycles became a new kind of language. Workers pedalled to factories at dawn, their lamps flickering along wet cobbles. Students carried books in baskets strapped to the handlebars. Messengers darted through the narrow streets like swallows, slipping past carts and trams with effortless grace. Everywhere, the rhythm of the city began to change, softer, smoother, more fluid. The great noise of progress now had a counterpart. The whisper of wheels, the murmur of freedom at ground level. Evening found the riders returning slowly, the sky fading through shades of rose and blue. Dust rose behind them like memory. Lamps were lit in the cottages, the smell of supper drifted through open windows. They pedalled more gently now, content to let the day unwind beneath them. The road ahead was lined with trees, their leaves dark against the light. Every turn of the pedals felt like a heartbeat winding toward rest. At last, they reached the gates of home. Bicycles leaned against walls and fences, their metal frames warm from the day. Chains glinted faintly in the dim light. Spokes still shimmered with the memory of sun. Inside the houses, laughter rose softly. The voices of families reuniting, of stories being told, of feet finding stillness again. Outside, the road quieted. The sound of hooves and wheels had faded long ago. Now only the whisper of wind moved through the hedgerows. The bicycle rested, its wheels slowly cooling. In the still air, the faint scent of oil lingered. Somewhere nearby, an owl called once, answered by silence. The stars appeared one by one, reflected faintly in the polished metal of the handlebars. In the darkness, the world seemed unchanged. The same roads, the same fields, the same night sky. Yet something subtle had shifted. The riders who slept inside their homes carried with them the knowledge of movement, of what it meant to glide through space by one's own strength. They had seen the countryside unfold at the rhythm of their breath, had learned that freedom was not a matter of distance, but of motion. Even when the age of engines returned with greater noise, when roads filled with automobiles and trains grew faster still, the memory of the bicycle endured, a gentler revolution that had turned not on power but on patience. It had taught a generation that speed need not come with sound, and that balance, once learned, never entirely leaves the body. And so the world continued, its people still moving, but now aware of how simple freedom could be. The curve of a road, the hum of tires on gravel, the steady turning of pedals beneath an endless sky. The road at last belonged to silence. And in that silence, humanity discovered the quiet joy of moving forward, not to escape, not to arrive, but simply to be in motion, breathing in time with the world itself. The quiet engines. And then came another sound, low, steady, different from all before. It began as a murmur, a faint vibration beneath the rhythm of hooves and wheels, something that seemed to rise out of the earth itself. The first engines were small, hesitant things, fragile-looking but filled with quiet promise. They did not neigh or breathe or tire. They turned and turned again, a mechanical heartbeat powered by fire and oil. Engines turned without horses, carriages rolled without reins. The first motor cars appeared on the roads like visiting ghosts from a new world, polished, deliberate, impossibly modern. Their shapes were boxy yet elegant, their wheels rimmed with brass, their lamps glimmering like twin eyes in the twilight. When they moved, the sound was neither the clip of hooves nor the creak of wood, but something continuous. A soft hum, a thread of motion that did not break. They moved slowly at first. The men who drove them wore long coats and caps, their hands firm on the levers and wheels. Their faces remained calm behind the drifting dust. Along the hedgerows, villagers paused to watch, their hands stilling in mid-labor. Children pointed and laughed. Dogs barked once and fell silent. The machines passed like a thought in motion, strange and gleaming, and then disappeared into the folds of the road. The smell changed first, no longer hay and leather, but oil, iron, and a faint sweetness of burned fuel. Smoke no longer rose from chimneys alone. It now trailed behind the new carriages, soft grey ribbons carried on the wind. The world began to hum. Roads were widened, stones smoothed, milestones repainted. The boundaries between near and far grew thinner. A journey that once filled a day now lasted an hour. The countryside adjusted itself, field by field, to the new rhythm. And yet, even as engines grew stronger, something gentle lingered in their sound. Beneath the hum, beneath the faint clatter of pistons, there was still the old music of travel. That calm, unhurried pulse that had once belonged to hoof and oar and wheel. The new world had not destroyed the quiet. It had merely changed its shape. In the early mornings, when mist lay over the roads and the dew had not yet lifted from the grass, the cars seemed almost human in their movement. Tentative, graceful, careful. Lamps glowed faintly through the haze, small halos of gold gliding across the grey. Drivers leaned forward, their eyes fixed on the path ahead, while the countryside drifted past, hedges blurred with light, cottages waking to the smell of coal fires, birds beginning to stir. The roads themselves were alive again, filled with the low vibration of change. By afternoon, the hum deepened, the light turned warmer, the air shimmered with the heat of motion. Fields that had once known only the sound of wind now heard the steady tone of engines passing. The people who worked there paused to watch, shading their eyes. Some frowned, others smiled. Few understood what they were seeing, but all felt the presence of something inevitable, the next rhythm in the long song of movement. For those who rode within the new machines, the experience was strange and intimate. There was no conductor, no reins, no living creature to command. Only the quiet insistence of the engine and the feel of the road beneath. The driver became both traveller and guide, listening to the heartbeat of the machine as though it were his own. Each turn of the crank, each shift of the gear was a conversation between human hands and mechanical patience. The countryside changed with it. Inns once built for horses opened their yards to cars. Blacksmiths learned to work with wrenches instead of hooves. Roadside signs appeared, painted with distances that now seemed shorter than before. A farmer might ride into town and return before his cows had finished grazing. The old world of slowness was not gone. It simply stood aside, watching as the new world rolled forward with quiet determination. Evening brought the most beautiful hours of travel. The sun sank low behind the hills, and the light gathered on the polished metal of the cars like liquid gold. Dust rose softly behind them, catching the glow. In the driver's seat, faces were calm, eyes half dreaming. The hum of the engine merged with the sounds of the evening. Crickets wind through trees, the faint toll of a far church bell. Everything moved in harmony. At night, the lamps burned steadily, their light spilling across the road like ribbons of amber. The cars moved slower then, their engines purring in rhythm with the pulse of the night. From a distance, they looked like small stars drifting just above the earth, carrying with them a warmth that contrasted with the cool silence of the countryside. The road, once ruled by the sound of hooves and wheels, now belonged to the hum, the quiet breath of progress. Some resisted it. They said the noise would frighten the cattle, that the speed would rob the world of its peace. But time proved otherwise. The peace remained, not gone, only rearranged. It hid in the pauses between the gears, in the glow of headlights against fog, in the way dust settled after a car had passed. The beauty of motion was not lost to the machine. It had simply found a new rhythm, one made of metal and patience. In the towns, people began to speak of the future. Roads were planned that would reach farther than any canal or railway. Maps grew denser, the lines between places shorter. The idea of travel changed once more, no longer a journey of endurance but of choice. To go anywhere, to move at will, to follow the horizon. This became the quiet dream of a century newly awake. And yet, beneath the growing speed, the essence of travel endured. In the glow of the lamps, in the slow drift of evening light across the bonnet, there was still that same calm that had lived in every form of motion before. The hush of the oar, the whisper of the wheel, the breath of the horse, the hum of the rail. The engines might be louder, the distances shorter, but within each journey there remained a stillness, a pulse, unbroken, unhurried, enduring. When the day's noise finally faded and the cars came to rest, the smell of warm oil lingered in the cooling air. The engines ticked softly as they slept. Beyond the hedgerows the night returned, filled once again with the sound of crickets and wind. The world exhaled, and for a moment it was as if all the roads of the earth had fallen quiet, waiting for dawn to begin again, for motion to rise softly, steadily, just as it always had. Reflections of movement. Now, in the stillness of memory, all those sounds remain. The creak of the coach, the sigh of steam, the soft hum of a wheel upon gravel. They linger like echoes inside the mind, familiar and unhurried, the residue of centuries in motion. Each sound belonged to its own age, the slow roll of wood upon stone, the deep breath of pistons, the whisper of tires turning through dust, yet all shared a single pulse, the slow, patient heart of travel. To listen closely to history is to hear movement itself, not as noise, but as rhythm. The steady clop of hooves fades into the hiss of the engine. The river's lap becomes the turning of propellers. The wind that once filled sails becomes the rush of air through open windows. The world changed shape, yet its heartbeat stayed the same. Each age thought it had invented motion, but motion had always been there, carrying humanity forward with the same quiet grace. Through all the centuries, people carried the same gentle wish to see beyond the horizon, to feel the air shift around them, to know the calm that distance brings. From the first road cut through the earth, to the shining decks of the great ships, from the dark tunnels beneath the cities to the bicycles that glided through the dawn. Every traveler shared that single desire, ancient and unspoken, to move, and in movement, to think, to breathe, to be. The forms altered, horse, ship, rail, wheel, engine, but the feeling did not. Beneath each new invention lay the same human stillness, the same wonder that first drew someone to step beyond the gate. The world's surfaces changed, iron instead of wood, oil instead of hay, speed instead of time. But the essence of travel remained untouched. What mattered was never the machinery, but the rhythm that the traveler carried within. The coach still moves along its stone road. If you listen, you can hear it, the soft strain of leather reins, the muffled drum of hooves through mist. Inside, passengers doze in their seats, the lanterns flickering in rhythm with the turn of the wheels. Somewhere, a driver hums under his breath, a tune older than the journey itself. The train still hums across the night fields. Its windows are pools of gold, sliding across the darkness like moving constellations. The whistle sounds once, not in haste, but in declaration, a note of motion that lingers long after the sound has gone. The fields pass unseen, the rivers cross beneath, and the passengers rest, trusting the rails to carry them forward through the dark. The bicycle still glides beneath the morning sun. Tires hiss gently on the road's surface, the pedals rise and fall in steady measure. A shadow keeps pace beside it, a second rider made of light. Wind moves through the grass and through the rider's hair, carrying the scent of earth, of flowers, of distance. Each turn of the wheel is an act of balance, of faith, a quiet surrender to motion and to the world's unfolding path. And somewhere beyond, on a wider scale, the ship still moves through silver water. Its hull divides the reflection of clouds, its wake trails behind like the memory of thought. The sea stretches out in every direction, calm and boundless, its surface marked only by the slow repetition of the waves. The passengers lean over the rail, the wind cool on their faces, their eyes following the horizon that always seems to remain just out of reach. Each of these moments, the coach, the train, the bicycle, the ship, still exists somewhere in the great quiet of time. They are not gone. They are folded, layered, continuing in the deep memory of the world. For history does not vanish, it moves softly beneath the surface. Motion, once begun, never entirely stops. In the reflection of history, motion appears not as haste, but as continuity. To move is not always to hurry. The wheel turns, but it also circles, a perfect image of return. Every journey carries within it the memory of those before, the coach remembering the cart, the car remembering the carriage, the train remembering the horse's rhythm, the ship remembering the wind. Every advance is a repetition in gentler form. And somewhere between all those journeys lies a still point, the quiet center of travel itself. It is not the destination nor the moment of departure, but the space in between, that delicate pause where one neither leaves nor arrives. In that moment, the traveler is both here and elsewhere, suspended in calm, existing in the pure rhythm of movement itself. The still point is where motion and peace meet, where the outer journey becomes an inner one. There, time softens. Roads and rails and seas become one long path, indistinguishable from one another. The same wind that once filled sails now brushes across glass windows. The same stars that once guided sailors now shine over quiet highways. Every route, every passage, every turning of a wheel leads back to the same truth, that travel is less about reaching and more about becoming. When we move, the world unfolds differently. Fields stretch wider, the air grows lighter, and thought slows until it matches the beat of the heart. The body moves through space, but the mind moves through memory. Every traveler carries with them the sounds of their past journeys. The coaches creak, the trains hum, the bicycles whisper. And within those sounds lives something eternal. In that place where motion becomes reflection, there is no rush, no arrival, no end. There is only continuity, the long, unbroken song of the world in motion. The roads of stone have turned to asphalt, the rails to electric hum, the sails to wings, yet all share the same music, the steady rhythm of persistence, the calm endurance of forward motion. And when the echoes of motion fade into the distance, when the last sound of travel quiets, what remains is the rhythm itself, that gentle pulse that has always guided every traveler. It beats beneath every journey, beneath every age, beneath every dream of elsewhere. It is the sound of humanity moving through time, steady, patient, and kind.